Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. We are going to begin this second session of our Seeking Justice in Arizona guest lecture series with ASU's land acknowledgement.
Arizona State University is located in Indian country. There are 22 tribal nations in Arizona. ASU's campuses are situated on the homelands of many indigenous peoples, including the Akimel, O'odham, and Pipash.
Arizona State University recognizes the original inhabitants of these lands
and recognizes that they still reside throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area.
And we recognize the impact of their wisdom and generosity towards us.
If you've flown into the valley, you have undoubtedly seen the Salt River Project canals that surround the area.
Those modern-day canals follow the framework of the canals originally constructed by ancestral Sonoran Desert people who come to make this area both livable and a place where peoples could thrive.
We acknowledge that the modern-day indigenous nations that descended from the ancestral peoples are the original inhabitants of this land.
We just had our land acknowledgement, and I was suggesting that such a gesture might be small and symbolic, and that we all can consider what steps we can take to ensure the sovereignty, security, and well-being of Native peoples. And I wanted to share with you, given the theme of this afternoon's talk, that the CDC tells us that Native people in this country overall are about 50% more likely to have a disability when compared to the national average, and that the National Congress of American Indians endorses increasing appropriations to the Vocational Rehabilitation Services projects for American Indians with disabilities, which is a program that increases tribes' capacity to serve their disabled citizens. So food for thought in terms of the role of policy and advocacy in pursuing disability justice. This is the 19th year that we've been doing this series here in the School of Social Transformation, where we invite 3 individuals, groups, or organizations, initiatives to share their chosen pathways to justice, to give each of us a sense of what it's like from the inside. What is it like to be involved in social change? We are able to learn other people's stories by asking them about their backgrounds, their pathways to seeking justice, the experiences and decisions, the turning points that they have experienced. So we are really excited about having our speaker this afternoon, who is Mr. J.J. Rico. He is the Chief Executive Officer at the Arizona Center for Disability Law, which is a protection and advocacy agency in Arizona. Prior to becoming CEO, JJ worked as ACDL's, the Arizona Center for Disability Law, ACDL, their litigation director, and as a staff attorney. His legal work focused on the employment and access provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we will be discussing this afternoon. JJ has also represented individuals with disabilities before both state and federal courts and administrative agencies. This afternoon, Mr. Rico will explain why he pursues disability justice through the legal enforcement of the ADA and how these local and national efforts have changed and stayed the same since the ADA went into effect about 33 years ago. We're also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Rehabilitation Act, which was passed in 1973. I think right behind our speaker in that beautiful background you've got, it actually says that, exactly, celebrating 50 years. To begin our conversation, as I've noted before, we think about how important naming and language is, and our guest and I have communicated already, and the organization uses the phrase people with disabilities. You also might hear the phrase disabled people or other kinds of language. And as we know, the recommended practice is to ask a person or a group or an organization what language makes sense to them, their choice. You might hear terms throughout this afternoon that are familiar to you or perhaps are new. So stay tuned and keep your ear out for terms like disability rights, disability justice, the phrase or the term ableism. You also might hear visible versus invisible disabilities. We will hopefully have enough time to talk about intersectionality and cross-movement solidarity. You might hear phrases like universal design or nothing about us without us. To help us historicize the federal frameworks which animate the work that our guest does, I'd like us to view a 10-minute video about the disability rights movement and passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is drawn from a documentary called Crip Camp. So we're going to show about a 10-minute clip that has been produced through Netflix for educational purposes. And it demonstrates how critical the disability rights and justice movements have been to passage of the policies and laws that our guest is now enforcing.
Every day, but you probably haven't thought about the layout of an elevator, unless you're a person with a disability. Chances are that you don't really think about any of the human-made physical structures you access each day. Architects and engineers refer to these things and spaces as the built world. It's a world that determines how we live and where we work. You might not have noticed, but much of that physical environment has quite literally been shaped by laws that protect the rights of people with disabilities. Before these laws were passed, places like restaurants, doctors' offices, and schools were not made with disabled people in mind. Being met with barriers such as stairs, narrow doorways, no curb cuts made it difficult, if not impossible, for many people with physical disabilities to access these spaces. Inaccessible buildings and transportation provided a routine reminder that the built world was made strictly for the non-disabled. But all that partially began to change with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, specifically with the enforcement of Section 504 that prohibits federally funded programs, agencies, and buildings from discriminating against disabled people. Section 504, as it is commonly known, also paved way for the historic signing of the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, in 1990. As chronicled in Crip Camp, it took years of relentless advocacy and protest before these laws were passed, and much of it was organized by a group of disabled teenagers who met at a summer camp in upstate New York, Camp Jened. And thanks to these former campers and many other leaders, our built world changed. Among the long list of things the ADA accomplished, like protecting against employment discrimination, it is now a legal requirement for our physical landscapes to be architecturally accessible to disabled people.
Well, before the ADA and even the passage of the regulations, the 504 regulations, it was really, really tough. Anything that I really wanted was at the whim of other people.
We couldn't come into the movie theater if we couldn't transfer out of our wheelchair. We had no expectation of accessible bathrooms. Our expectations basically were low.
In some cases, the change measures in inches. In other instances, entire new structures have been created.
The experience of making this film has radically changed the way I view the world around me.
You've already seen the ADA's impact on our built world. You just may not have noticed it. For instance,
our tax money was going into buses and trains, but we couldn't get on it.
I love the good. I used to stuff with a lot. I used to go to the subway, climb up and down the steps. I was more worried about the police. I was more worried about the police than I was about getting up and down because the police would stop us.
Did you understand?
No.
So the subways in New York were not accessible at that time. But Neil was able to get around. And what he would do is he would frequently go up and down the stairs on his butt. And the police, instead of helping him, would frequently tell him he couldn't do it. So denying the right to transit.
So before the ADA, most people with physical disabilities couldn't access public transportation. It meant that many people couldn't even leave their homes. But nowadays, public transportation has become accessible for many, adding features like ramps, accessible seating, and elevators in some subway stations. The ADA also has provisions for streets and sidewalks. They can be inaccessible to wheelchair users and people who are blind or low vision. You know those small ramps you see everywhere built into the pavement? Those are curb cuts, and they're meant for a disabled person to safely navigate the streets, not just for your scooter. So now, not only can a wheelchair user easily maneuver between the sidewalk and the street, but a blind or low vision pedestrian can also know when they've reached a street.
And ask anybody who's pushed a stroller how much easier it is to use a curb cut.
Parking lots, too, have been transformed by the ADA.
When I got my car at the age of 17, there were no handicap parking spots. And so I had to find locations where I could get my wheelchair in and out of my station wagon.
It's totally different now. For every 25 parking spaces in a lot, at least one needs to be for accessible parking. And some of those accessible parking spaces must be wide enough for a person with a disability to safely exit a vehicle. And by the way, those reserved parking spaces also follow ADA rules. But what about buildings themselves? Not only were public spaces inaccessible for people with disabilities, but often there were architectural barriers in their private homes as well.
I grew up in a home and I lived on the second floor of a water apartment building, and my parents never thought about moving. My parents thought that the only alternative was to make me walk. And so I spent years and years and years without a wheelchair, walking on crutches, and it really wasn't the best way for me to get around, but it was the only solution that my parents and therapists and non-disabled people had for somebody like Mitch.
Just simply being able to get into businesses where, there's a step up. And so I couldn't get into many places.
But that ramp you usually walk past on a regular day? Yep, that was installed as per the ADA because stairs just don't work for everyone. Ever wonder why there's usually a static door or a gate next to a revolving door? That's right, to make it easier for a person in a wheelchair to access the building. But once inside, a building's interiors could also be a barrier for people with disabilities. Take bathrooms, for instance.
Yeah, I can get into your restaurant, but I want to be able to hang out there for a while. And if your bathroom is not accessible, it's really kind of a no-go for me to be there.
You know those wide bathroom stalls? They're not fitting rooms or places to do your yoga. Those were created to give enough room for wheelchair access. Also, for a wheelchair user, sinks that are too high without leg space are cumbersome. But by following the ADA guidelines, sinks can be installed at the right level to be accessible. And it's not just the buildings and the streets and transportation that need to be ADA compliant. It's the things you never consider. Like that elevator from before, you don't notice it while using it, but the usable parts are at a certain height from the ground to be wheelchair accessible. But here's the thing, it doesn't cater to a person who's blind. Our built world is therefore selectively accessible.
Many people who have a disability and are protected by Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act don't see themselves in this law.
And it's incomplete. Like, not all subway stations have built-in elevators. For instance, only a quarter of New York City's subway stations are accessible. Similarly, restaurants far and wide have yet to adopt Braille menus for blind people. It has been 30 years since the ADA was signed, but its laws are yet to be universally applied to our built world.
I think that some people think that the ADA is, if we follow these rules, we're doing it right. The ADA is a floor, it's not a ceiling.
And that's a problem, because unless it applies everywhere, people with disabilities cannot fully participate in their communities.
If I have to feel thankful about an accessible bathroom, when am I ever going to be equal in the community?
A good first step is to begin thinking about disability rights as basic human rights.
Would you like to see handicapped people depicted as people?
Excuse me?
It can't just be on us as disabled people to be making these changes. It really has to be a societal change.
The ADA actually improves access for all. I mean, think about it. You've probably used the elevators in the subway station. There were some before the ADA, but now entire systems have them. And that's just one example of how we all benefit from the ADA every day.
I think one of the most beautiful things I learned about working on the project was this concept of universal design. And it's the idea that if you design something or you make something that works for all people, it's going to be better for everybody.
So, on any given day, when you do end up using an ADA feature, you have a generation of disability rights activists to thank for that convenience.
So you all have us to thank for this.
Thank you. I want to reemphasize that although the film itself, the clip, was addressing you as if you didn't have a disability, a lot of assumptions going on there, that there are many of us who do notice those curb cuts, who do notice inaccessible bathrooms, etc. So now I'd like us, with this background, to turn to our guest speaker, Mr. JJ Rico, and welcome you to our series and ask you to tell us about yourself, about your organization, the responsibilities that you have, and why you're doing the work that you do.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. It's always an honor and pleasure to talk about myself, but more importantly, to talk about the organization and the great work that we do. And watching that movie makes me thankful for those civil rights activists before me, because really without that law, as an attorney, I wouldn't have a law to enforce. And so they gave me, the law in which to take before courts and administrative agencies, et cetera. But a little bit about myself, just so you know who's talking to you today. And again, I'm talking with you. So if you do have questions, I know there's time at the end, but I obviously do not feel wedded to that they have to be at the end. They can come anytime during. And I know also, Madeline, you will ask me questions and feel free. It will be much more enjoyable and conversational at the same time. So I am an attorney. I've been doing this position or worked for ACDL for 22 years next month. Hard to believe. And so that's where I'll start. So about 22 years ago, probably last week was about 22 years from my first interview for the Center for Disability Law. I just graduated from law school. I know some of you have law school aspirations. Hopefully disability law is in your future. As an employer, I want more disability rights attorneys. But when I first interviewed about 22 years ago, one of the first questions that I was asked by the then executive director was, what do you know about disability law? And I paused. And again, as a lawyer, you learn how to talk and, kind of play it, go on your feet. And actually, I had never taken disability law in law school. It was a course that I think was offered probably every third year. And even now, it's not offered every year, at least at the U of A where I went. So I really thought about it, and I'm like, it would not be good just to say I don't know anything. That probably would have really excluded me, and I wouldn't be sitting here before you today. So where I went was family experience, and that's where a lot of us draw kind of where we come from, why we are where we're at, and I do a lot of that reflection now, but also then because that's how I was raised by, the strong women in my life. Although I had male figures, I think the women figures in my life most definitely gave me the advocacy tools of speak up for yourself, speak if something's not right. So then I drew reference to my grandfather at the time, who was using a wheelchair, was not always a wheelchair user, had lost the ability to speak clearly. He had ataxia, which is kind of similar to ALS or Lou Gehrig's. And so he loved going out to eat. So I would tag along, and oftentimes we would encounter barriers of his table he needed to sit at. So I knew where to ask, and I knew that there was a smoking section that had tables, but he wasn't a smoker, didn't want to be exposed to smoke. So there was one table I always knew, even as a teenager, to ask for that could work. It wasn't the real accessible table, but it could work, and it was something that he wanted. I negotiated a car deal for him when I was 16 years old. I got to write at that point, which I thought was the largest check I'd ever write in my life, of $17,000. My grandfather was, again, clear of mind, but abilities were losing of speech. So he kind of prepped me, and he told me how to negotiate and how to slip over the check and say, this is all we have. And it gave me an exposure to some of the discrimination there as well. I mean, again, had they taken the time, just in this video, you saw people who had some challenges speaking, but if you gave them the opportunity, you could understand what they said. But in the world that I was living next to my grandfather, there was an assumption that they could take advantage, even probably more so than maybe the car dealers of the world at that time. And so I had to advocate for him. At that time, also, I kind of drew from, I had an uncle who I'm still a caregiver for today, that lived with my grandparents, that at the time, culturally, in the Mexican American culture, you don't say someone has a serious mental illness. That wasn't really a label you used. And so my uncle was always told to me that he was sick or he wasn't well. But I've learned to know that schizophrenia is a mental illness, and that's why he was at home and why he received public benefits and, had some of the challenges he had, and why we had some of the experiences we had as well. So I shared that story and how I learned a great deal from him, being an advocate for him. Even during my time in this position, I've learned that as well. And then right around the time of the interview, both my parents were having a lot of difficulties maintaining employment, and due to physical disabilities. And so my mom had just gone on long-term disability. My dad was, having some challenges keeping a job that was physical in nature, that was kind of his strength, but he wasn't able to kind of maintain that level of physical performance. And so I saw, my mom go on long-term disability, but still advocate for benefits and advocate for insurance and navigate all those things that are crucial, right? Healthcare, maintain your healthcare, maintain stable housing. So I shared all of that information and really kind of what I learned through those personal experiences, and then how I could tie it into the job. And then I went to law school because I knew I wanted to advocate, and I knew I wanted to be an advocate for people that didn't have access to justice. You hear about that term, access to justice. It's essentially people who really didn't have access to a lawyer, didn't have access to the knowledge that they needed to enforce those rights. And so I shared that as well. So although there wasn't a direct disability law class that I took, I comboed all that into a nice little answer, probably not as eloquently as I'm putting out there today. But I guess it convinced them to make the choice and to select me for the staff attorney position. And I focused mainly on employment, which we'll talk about today. Grew into the accessibility provision. So a lot of those physical access cases you heard about in the clip. I worked a lot on movie theater captioning. So if you go to Harkins movie theaters, which I know is a big theater, had a long case with them, and I'll share kind of some of what we were able to achieve. I'm a big sports fan. I know I'm cutting into some of that Diamondbacks game today, but if you go to the stadium, if you've ever been in Chase, if you've ever been in a State Farm for the Cardinals and you see captionings up on the screen, that was the case that I worked on as well. So I was able to intersect my true love, which is sports, but I knew I couldn't get paid just watching sports. So I comboed that with some of the legal advocacy for people who wanted to watch sports, and I got to go to some stadiums and got to go to some movies and other things that are fun. So that's kind of how I generally got here. There's a lot of other steps in the road and things that I can share, but I'll take me through some questions and I'll be happy to answer them. But that's kind of how I got the job. They haven't got rid of me since, and I guess I've got a few promotions along the way, and that's happens. The last thing I'll say, because I know you're in college right now and thinking about your future, is find something you're passionate about, because it makes the job more rewarding. And I know that's easy to say. I mean, but I always draw reference to one of my older son asked me early in my career. He said, "Is your job fun?" And I still wouldn't say, as much as I love what I do, it's not fun. I'm not throwing parties every day and wearing a hat, but I really love what I do. And so find that thing that you're passionate about that kind of fits that personal niche. So I tell that story about my personal background because that really was what I was raised with, being an advocate, being with others. I really thrived in that environment. Teachers often told me if I didn't start using my energy and my voice in the right way, I'd probably get in a lot of trouble. I got a lot of bad grades in conduct. So one teacher said you'd make a great lawyer, and I guess they were right, because I probably was arguing too much with them. But find out, kind of what your skills are. I mean, I know sometimes parents are telling you and pressuring you on like, this is what you should do. But I think it's what's going to be rewarding at the end of the day. And I've learned to appreciate that a lot more. I mean, I have a 16-year-old child. I have a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old now. And my 16-year-old son is a child with a disability. And so he's made me appreciate that, you do the best and the most you can in the circumstances you're given, but you make your life and whatever your future is rewarding. And so if you can kind of figure that out, I mean, I know that's a heavy lift for someone who, various ages in the audience. But like at the end of the day, step back and think about what is that. And if it is in disability rights after day, great. I'm really excited about that. But if it's in something else, just make sure it's rewarding and that you find not only joy in it, but also in something that you feel you can wake up every day. And that's something that I really find in this position. I can wake up every day not knowing what lays ahead, but also know I'm going to make a difference in someone's life. So that's why I keep doing it. And you might think, gosh, I could never work for someplace for 22 years. I didn't think so either. But I hope that they don't kick me out too soon. I still have a lot of work left to do. There's a lot of good disability rights advocacy still to be done. So I'm not going anywhere unless they kick me out.
I so appreciate your enthusiasm and the personal story that helps us understand where you came from and where you're going. And you'll be there for quite a while as the CEO of the center now. Can you help us, if we take a step back, we've been throwing out some of these words with the film, and you've also mentioned them. Some of them are behind you as well in your background. Can you explain what the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990 and the Rehabilitation Act from 1973 are, and who's actually protected? On what basis are
Sure.
people protected?
Sure. We'll start with the ADA just because it's the newer of the two laws. So the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, you probably saw Bush 1 in that picture of the clip. And so in kind of plain language, it's a civil rights law. The civil rights law that has provisions in it that cover employment in Title I. Title IIs and Title III is kind of your public access. So all of you who are at ASU, that's a Title II entity. So your state, local governments access to programs and services, not just building access. So I know that clip talked a lot about physical things that you all see, like curb cuts or elevators, or probably ways to get into that classroom, but it also is applies to programs and services. So your classrooms, right? So if any of you were to receive services or accessibility service, student services, that could come under Title II if you get extra time for tests, things like that. Title IV is your communication, some of your relay communications or public communication information. So in Title V is retaliation, which means you can't discriminate against someone who's enforced their rights. So that's the ADA. So it really, somebody said in the clip that said it's a floor. It's a civil right that says this is basic what you should not do. That's how I see it, right? You should not discriminate on the basis of disability. So if you're making a decision and a negative one based on someone's disability, that's discrimination. If you're not hiring somebody because of a disability, that's discrimination. But that does not tell you that, oh, what you need to do. So there are accessibility guidelines that do lay out all those widths and dimensions that you saw. But again, that's the start point. To me, that just says that's the minimum. And so when people stop at the minimum, there are other barriers. And that's what that clip was trying to say as well, right? If you just do that, you probably have not covered every situation. But if your design is, with another term used, and there was universal design. I don't know if any of you have ever gone to Ability 360. It's on 50th Street in Washington. Our Phoenix office is in that building. That is a beautiful image of what universal design should be. Yes, it is a building that was built for disability-based organizations. But if you slapped another name on there, or there were other tenants in there, you would never think about all the accessibility features that exist, because it would just seem like it was meant to be, right? So the bathrooms don't have, the bathroom entries don't have doors, but they have a curve. So you can't just look straight in and see someone going to the bathroom, but a simple curve with a wide enough access point, you don't need a door. To make all your stalls large enough, again, not just one, but all of them, so that for various reasons, people either need additional space for disability reasons, for parents reasons, et cetera. There are some hidden features that are really cool. Like, again, access into, like, the gym. They have a fully accessible gym. So for those of you who work out, they have to get into their restrooms tiles that have grooves on them that are actually directional grooves that will guide someone who's using a cane into the space with, because again, if you don't have that directional aid or an assistant, which not all people with disabilities have an assistant, you can access the bathroom. So that is, kind of the ADA. You asked about the Rehab Act as well. And so the Rehabilitation Act, I would say, is the pre-ADA law. Obviously, 73 becomes before 90. I don't know. Again, I learned about that much math back in the day, but it only applied to federal programs and services. And so the ADA, as you heard, applies to private sectors. So your Walmarts of the world, your Harkins movie theaters, all of those things. But the Rehab Act is just applying to the federal government, to their programs and services, to employment, federal employees. So if you think about it that way, so we got everybody covered, right? Federal government's covered by the Rehab Act, your private sector's covered by Title I and Title III, and then your public, kind of ASUs and your cities are covered by Title II of the ADA. So you have your federal law, they're all federal laws. There are some also state and local ordinances that exist. So your state laws that apply here in the ADA is called the Arizonans with Disabilities Act. And then each city has a civil rights ordinance that probably will have listed. I don't have them all memorized, but they should all include a language that says shall not discriminate. And then one of those classes or groups should be disability, in mostly all cities out there as well. So I kind of went off and all around, but hopefully I came back to answer your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if you could help us, because the film itself focused mainly on physical, often thought of as visible disabilities. Could you speak to civil rights and non-discrimination protections for people with less visible or known disabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also brings me back to what is a disability according to the ADA. So when I started telling my family, right, I'm working with the ADA. Some of them thought the American Dental Association, some of them thought the workers' comp, some of them thought Social Security. But the ADA has a unique definition. The ADA is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits at least one major life activity. And so that can include people with physical disabilities, as I just said, could be someone who uses a wheelchair, might be someone who only has one limb but can't, may not be able to use their right arm at all. But also there's also protection for people with physical or mental that doesn't say it has to be visible. Also within that definition, it doesn't say you have to have a diagnosis. A lot of people assume that I have to go to a doctor. Where do I get my note that says I have a disability? And there's not necessarily, even if you have a diagnosis, you may not necessarily be a person with disability that meets that definition that I just said. But to more specifically answer your question, not all disabilities are physical, right? So we have a lot of disabilities that if you, I guess, were to look at someone you may not know. The example that I often give is someone with a mental illness. You would not know from looking with them, talking to them. There may be no manifestation of the disability at all, regardless of, diagnoses, right? So my uncle, on a good day, although I shared with you has schizophrenia, on a good day, and you talk to him, you may have no idea. On a bad day, you probably would know something's not quite, what you would normally hear from someone who does not have schizophrenia. But again, it's not always obvious. People with disabilities don't wear badges or don't have cards. Not all people with disability are on Social Security. There's not and it's also good to say that the ADA has a non-exhaustive list of disabilities, which means there is a list of disabilities. If you read the ADA, there's a list of examples, but it's an example list. And so disabilities, are really defined by courts. And so that's kind of weird, right? So you're talking to an attorney who I've taken cases where someone who was HIV positive was challenged whether they had a disability. I have represented a young woman when mental retardation was still a label and a diagnosis in the DSM-4 at that time, where that was challenged as well. And so that's evolved over time. The challenges in the disability law field have changed from that base level of are they a person with a disability to where now after the ADA Amendment Act of 2008, the focus is more where I think it should be on how can an employer or how can an agency or how can a municipality accommodate a person with a disability.
That's a great segue to be thinking about some of the meaningful cases that you've been working on over 2 decades plus efforts here in the state of Arizona. So I'm wondering if you could particularly focus on workplace discrimination. In your background, we learned that October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, that significantly, disproportionately, people with disabilities are or underemployed. So could you talk to some of the ways that you've been able to advocate for non-discrimination in the workplace?
Great, sure. And so I shared with you how I believe I got the job from that interview, but what I left out because I knew this question was coming was what was I doing when I first got hired? And it was employment discrimination, and it was directly related to Walmart's discrimination against 2 young deaf men. So my supervisor at the time had brought a lawsuit against Walmart representing these 2 young men who were deaf, who I'll try to be as quick as possible with the case example. They both were deaf. One of their mothers worked at Walmart. The mother was not deaf, was hearing. They made an announcement at work saying we're hiring, tell people to come and apply. Both sons went and applied. Obviously, they shared or identified themselves as people who were deaf, and they were told they were not hiring. So mom went back and said, "Are we hiring?" And they said, "Yes, we're hiring." And they said, well, they learned that basically they were hiring, but they weren't hiring people who were deaf. And so ACDL brought the lawsuit, got a good resolution in the form of a settlement. Walmart unfortunately didn't do what they were supposed to, so the judge was quite upset, hit them with a number of fees and sanctions. And so as you watch the Georgia trial and you hear about President Trump potentially getting fined and sanctioned, sometimes judges do that. And in this situation, they fine them a significant amount of money. At that time, I think it was $400,000 or so. And so the board of directors for ACDL thought, well, why don't we expand our employment practice and hire a young attorney to monitor compliance with the lawsuit? So that's where I was hired from. I was not paid $400,000, but I was paid to monitor the lawsuit. And one of those provisions was to employ more people who were deaf. And so for probably the first 2 years of my career, I represented many people who were deaf, who were trying not only to work for Walmart, but for other employers. And so with that experience, I learned a lot about deaf culture. So I don't know if we have any students in the audience who are deaf or have experience with deafness or family members who might be deaf, but I learned American Sign Language is not English. There are two separate languages. So if you know ASL, does not mean you know English. Forms of accommodations can be many different accommodations. You can have ASL interpreters. You can have captioning. And this is my first example where I date myself. So I represented a woman who was hired by Walmart, was trained with ASL interpretation, doing very well, did so well that she was going to be honored as like Employee of the Month or Employee of the Year or something like that. And so I guess they gave her a note, come to this event. So she really didn't know what it was about. They didn't provide her an interpreter to tell her. So she showed up. And so it's a nice little award ceremony. And then they just kind of push her on stage and give her an award. But what they did not do was provide a sign language interpreter for her to understand what the award was about, what she was being honored, if they were saying any nice things. So it taught me early on that the law doesn't just apply if you are working in the job, it's also to those benefits, those privileges, those other outside of the normal 9 to 5 if a business is offering to provide something like an award ceremony. So I learned a lot about that. The other thing I learned that dated myself was that sometimes the accommodations that a person with a disability may need might already exist and cost no money. So again, I love to talk about Walmart because I guess in a way they gave me my first job. And so Walmart used to do announcements over the loudspeaker, meeting in the back room, 5 minutes to break time, et cetera, et cetera. And they had disciplined one of my clients for not showing up. So I told them, I said, they don't know about this meeting because the way you're making those announcements are over the loudspeaker and they're a person who's deaf who cannot hear. So they're like, well, what's the solution? Should we have someone run out and tap them and drag them to the meeting or those kind of things? And I said, well, I think in your store, don't you have pagers? And again, I don't know if anybody in the student audience there knows what the heck I'm talking about when I say a pager, but it used to be these little boxes you would carry around on your side, and they would buzz and they would give you a phone number of who to call back. So before you even had a phone in your pocket, you used to have something that told you, hey, you need to call someone. And it didn't even say, hey, call me. So it was even before texting. It was just a number that came up. And those of us who were really creative could make words out of those numbers. But so again, for the teachers and others who are there to remember, I hope you have a laugh about that. For the students who are like, what is this guy talking about? What I'm talking about is I came up with a numeric system that said number 1 means meeting, number 2 means break time, et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, well, how can we do that? That's very expensive. I said, pull it off your shelf, give it to the employee. Well, they're going to steal it. Okay, well, then why don't you have them turn in their keys at the beginning of the day and then turn back their, the pager and they get their keys at the end of the day. Some of these things, and this is what my message is here, especially in Employment Awareness Month, is it doesn't take a lot of money oftentimes. The average accommodation for people with disabilities, the last stat I saw was about $500. And sometimes all it takes is a little creativity and it takes a dialogue. It takes a dialogue between the person with the disability and the employer. And if you're actually listening, you might be able to problem solve for little to no money and keep a great employee. Now that I wear the employer hat, that's my number one goal is the most staff I can retain, which means keep them as long as possible, is a benefit to our agency, right? Because we're investing a lot, they're investing a lot. And why would I want to have high turnover where I'm having to go out and find someone new every year? And so I really try to, share that with the employers who, when I was representing employee or doing trainings like this, it was really something I pushed. With proper training, with proper accommodations, you're going to have a long-term employment relationship, which is a benefit both to the employee and to the employer.
Those are great examples drawn from your experience at work to ensure that other people get access, not just access to work, but also inclusion once they arrive. And that actually reflects the ASU charter. I know we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about education discrimination, so those might come up in questions from students at the end. I'm going to pitch you to ask about that if you want to. One of the things that we wanted to address was thinking about the differential that might be geography based. So here we are mainly in the greater Phoenix area, but you are a center that, might address discrimination or compliance to court orders in a variety of spaces. So could you talk a little bit about some of the differences that you've observed, maybe some of the strengths or assets that you see, whether it's rural, suburban, or urban sprawl, and some of the differences or barriers that you might have observed based on population density?
Yeah. I mean, I think you guys will probably like this answer because it's going to be shorter than my others, is urban Phoenix, Tucson, Maricopa, Pima County have a lot more resources. When I say resources for people with disabilities in the cases we handle, we see that in access to healthcare services. So if any of you go into healthcare, access or All-Tex or Medicaid system here in Arizona, those are public health benefits that you receive or you qualify for. And so you may have a plan that requires therapies, for example. If you live in Maricopa or Pima County, you're more likely to find a provider, as they call it. So find a therapist or attendant care or respite care or nursing care services. If you live outside of those two counties, it's not that it's non-existent, but you get put on what's called a wait list. And really, the state's not supposed to have wait lists. Those are not supposed to exist. But essentially what the state says is we're looking. We've made a vendor call, which means we put out a request to find someone for you, for your child, for your family member. And so you're not getting a denial, right? Because if there was a denial, then you have an appeal, you have a recourse. So they're a little slick with their words. They're kind of like, no, you're just kind of in this limbo. But yeah, outside of the two main counties, that's pretty common experience to have these wait lists. Now, so where we get involved is really pushing, because you have, once you say and you come up with this plan and you've approved them for the services, it's your obligation for the state to provide them. And so we really try to push the state as much as we can, through individual advocacy or through systemic advocacy. We try to identify systemic issues because, again, as a nonprofit law firm, we don't have all the lawyers in the world to take cases. So we sometimes, take that one case of that one example that is a policy issue that applies to many different people. So yeah, in short, the big two counties see a lot of resources, see a lot of providers, and the rural counties do not. If I can, I know one of the other things I was supposed to touch on is kind of a little more about ACDL. So hopefully I've piqued your interest with a couple of these stories and say, hey, I want to learn some more. So let me tell you in short. So ACDL, the Arizona Center for Disability Law, exists. There's an office like ours in every state and territory. So if any of you are from a different state, let's say California, their P&A, their Protection and Advocacy Agency, is called Disability Rights California. And so every state territory has an office like ours. And we came into existence as a result of an investigative report in Willowbrook in Staten Island. It's a developmental disability institution. For some of you who may recognize the Geraldo Rivera, before he was on Fox, he did a lot of investigative reporting, and he took his camera in. A doctor let him in, literally let him in the back door, and he took his camera in and videotaped this developmental disability institution. And what he uncovered was horrific. That's a term he uses in his video. So in addition to Crip Camp, I also challenge you to Google Willowbrook or go on YouTube and type in Willowbrook. And so his cameras found people, not clothed, malnourished, people with various disabilities that really did not need a high level of care or an institutional level of care. I don't believe anybody needs that type of institutional setting, especially with home and community-based services being the way that we all should look at for our disability community. And so following that, Congress passed a series of laws called the Protection and Advocacy Laws. So the first one was protection and advocacy for people with developmental disabilities. So it created offices like ours. Why are we unique? Is because we can still to this day go into facilities and institutions announced or unannounced. And so here's where my college joke comes in, is if you all think about if your parents just showed up unannounced, how would your apartment, your dorm room, et cetera, look today, right? If they just unlocked the door, walked in, you didn't know they were coming, it's probably going to look very different if they said, we're on our way. Even if they gave you 15 minutes, you'd probably be able to clean up. So having that access authority, that unannounced access authority, gives us a unique ability to make sure people are free from abuse and neglect. And so that's our underlying foundation. So we still do that and still do a lot of that work. Unfortunately, our prisons and jails have become kind of the modern day institutions. So we do a lot of work in that space as well. But we also do, as I'm describing, a lot of community-based work like disability employment discrimination, et cetera, because people with disabilities do not live or all live in institutions. So sorry I didn't bring that up earlier, but I thought I could tie it in and share a little bit more about our agency.
That is that kind of insight, that background is extraordinarily helpful. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this intersection between disability and being someone who's been incarcerated by the state or federal government.
Yeah, so not my complete expertise. Our deputy legal director has really focused a lot of her career and time at ACDL and being the lead counsel on our case against the Department of Corrections, along with the ACLU and the Prison Law Office project. But in short, people with disabilities are incarcerated at higher rates than people without disabilities. And so our lawsuit uncovered that once someone is incarcerated in the Department of Corrections, they were either being under-identified or once identified as someone with either healthcare or mental health care needs, they were not receiving the services they need. Now, let me ask, again, you don't have to raise your hand, but if anybody out there watches John Oliver, John Oliver recently just did a piece on HBO about this exact issue. And unfortunately, Arizona was the star of the show, meaning that there were many examples of Arizona's prisons and Arizona's inadequate healthcare and mental health care services for our prisoners with various disabilities. So we do see that happening a lot. And then once they are within our correctional system, if you do some research, if this is a project any of you are interested in, you'll also see the healthcare model for prisons is really a for-profit model, which I guess is not unique to the prison system. But when you do that, then you're trying to minimize the amount of staff time with your patients and then woefully inadequate services to increase your profits. And so the John Oliver piece does a much more comedic way of delivering the message than I am right now. But he also, it's a very important message that I think he highlights through his kind of comedic lens, but also really stresses the importance of adequate healthcare to all people. Because essentially, in short, our prisons are not treating prisoners as people. You know, they're seeing them as ways to make a profit.
I appreciate you emphasizing that, and we'll include the clip or at least a link to it for those of you who have access to John Oliver's program in the resources that we circulate. We're going to move to students and attendee questions in just a moment, so get those ready, jot them down, put them in the chat, whatever you want to do. I just want to observe that given the disproportionate number of people of color, Black and brown people who are incarcerated, we can think about there being, we talked about a school to prison pipeline, but there's some kind of disability to prison pipeline as well. So that the folks that you're talking about experiencing this woefully inadequate healthcare, including mental health care, likely also experienced various forms of institutionalized racism. So we're thinking about this intersectionality all the time. One of the questions we like to ask people before we shift to some of the students and attendees questions is, this work is very joyful and enriching and meaningful, but it's also really difficult. It's really hard. So what kinds of things do you do to sustain yourself and as a member of your community to keep going, to go to year 23?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that yeah, I think for all of you, I kind of generally ask the survey of what all of fields you might be all going into, and I do hope you go into advocacy. But when you're fighting these big battles and these big systems, and you're representing someone who's not doing so well, and you're their lifeline, and sometimes justice may be on your side, but the decision's not, you do need things that recharge. So that's my first message to you, is to find something that's different. Now, y'all might get a joke out of this. I try to do something that's totally void of the law, right? I don't understand those lawyers who watch law programs and all those other things. Like, I'm a lawyer during the day. I don't want to watch Law and Order. So I don't think I've ever watched, I know I haven't watched more than 2 episodes of Law and Order. So again, prepare to laugh. I watch things like Jersey Shore. Like, those people are like, I don't know, that's kind of the life that I never had, right? To live on the shore, party all the time, and still do that 20 years or how long, Snooki is going to be a grandma by the time she goes off. So I really try to do something that's separate, that gives me a time to kind of just be away and in charge. Obviously, my family keeps me very busy as well. And I always say my family's my first job. So, we try to do a lot of activities. My son and my wife, they keep me active. I have now a college student who I moved out to Oregon State, who that was kind of exciting. So for some of you who've had that, maybe your parents weren't excited, but I was happy to go furniture shopping and other things for him. So I try to do things that are, really, to me, one, take me away, and then two, keep me grounded. And my family keeps me grounded, because at the end of the day, I want to be a dad and a husband first. And sure, I got that fancy title, but my wife is nearby, and she can tell you I'm not the boss anywhere. Once I'm at home, I'm not anybody's boss. I get told what to do just like anybody else. So I just try to keep myself grounded, and prepare myself for each day the best way I can.
Thanks so much, JJ. What kind of questions do you all have for our guest speaker, in the room or online? If you're online, please submit it through the chat. If you're in the room, make yourself available to the closest speaker or microphone that you have there.
Okay. I was just wondering, as like a young voter, what kind of language should we be looking for when it comes to advancing the ADA?
Okay, so as a young voter, you're looking, what type of language you're looking for when you're voting for someone or some issue?
Yeah.
Okay. Inclusion. I think we're still in this mentality that separate is equal, especially when it comes to the disability community. So disability, we didn't quite get into this, but disability is in every section. I think the video touched on it, and it was a point I was going to make as well, is, everywhere we look is impacted by ability and disability, so there's not one area. So when you hear a candidate speak, are they even bringing up disability? To me, that's frustrating when it is actually the largest group, minority group, if you want to use the word minority, of any out there, but you do not hear candidates mention disability, right? And if you talk about healthcare, that impacts the disability. If you're bringing up issues about access to education, that impacts the disability community. So if you are active in voting and active in the process, ask those questions. What is your disability platform? They should have one, and if they don't, then that might be a candidate you want to move on from or help. I mean, if it's a candidate you're really in support of, the other thing to do is make sure they're educated on disability issues so they can have a platform, a piece on their website, a flyer. Be prepared for that. So we do disability candidate forums, and we ask, we're nonpartisan, so it's not a Republican or a Democrat issue. As you saw, Bush 1 signed, the ADA. We got our third largest program signed under the Trump administration. So disability should not be a partisan issue. So, but it should be an issue that every candidate should have on their platform and have something to say.
Thanks, JJ. We've got a question from an online attendee, Melissa. Thank you. they're asking, what's the ratio between the number of complaints that you receive and also take action on that address visible versus invisible disabilities, noting that Melissa has had some personal and professional experience with not receiving the required accommodations that were needed.
Yeah, it's hard to put percentages on it because I mean we do obviously ask for when we're doing intakes for a person's disability. I would say it might be 50-50. I mean, it actually is probably more invisible than visible. I say this based on experiences that when you see a visible disability, oftentimes it is um, easier to accommodate because people can see it. They've had opportunity. If you encounter someone with a wheelchair, accommodating, a wheelchair access is sometimes a little bit more measurable, right? Where an invisible disability, there are a lot of ranges, depending on, let's say, if it's a mental illness, just because it's depression. Depression could impact one's abilities to concentrate, may impact another person's ability to interact with others. So the duty to accommodate is still there, but how or what accommodation to provide. So there are challenges. I know the question went away. There was a second piece as well besides the percentages. Sorry, I forgot.
It was about the work that you've done, not just in terms of the complaints that you've received, but in terms of the actions that you've taken.
Yeah, so all over the place. So one of the things ACDL does is can provide services from just giving you self-advocacy. Basically, self-advocacy tips could be where to go and file a complaint, or how to self-advocate to your disability resource center office if it's a higher education issue. We've taken lawsuits, as you've heard in some of the examples that I've provided. We've done system complaints with administrative agencies where it's not just one person, but it's a group of people who may be impacted by a discriminatory policy. And then we've also done class actions, where again it's a class of people, but it's a lawsuit. So that Department of Corrections lawsuit was a class action lawsuit. So it really it kind of is the whole spectrum of services that we can provide. In my time more actively practicing, I probably used all of those tools and relayed all of those tools to clients or prospective clients.
It sounds like you're encouraging folks who are attending and observing, if they're interested in law school, that's a pathway to do some of this work, but that you can also be an advocate both for yourself and for people around you, like you've explained for your family members, in understanding, being aware of the rights that we have and making sure that they're being protected. And we really appreciate you taking your time and a really, really busy workday, knowing how many complaints you're working on, and that you are the CEO of this organization. Thank you for raising our awareness about some of the federal, state, and local laws and policies, and really for giving us some concrete steps to take as we seek justice seek disability justice in Arizona and beyond. And we'll be sharing some more of those resources. I do want to take this chance to say thank you to my colleagues, Professor Kwan, and our staff, Brittany, Jennifer, Haley, and Gina, for all their work they did behind the scenes, behind the screens that you're seeing, and to also invite you and welcome you to our third and final installment of this year's Seeking Justice in Arizona series, which will take place on Monday, November 13th at 1:30, when we're going to be welcoming Christy Moore and Glinda Henderson, who are going to be talking about social spin laundromat. So redefining laundromats, building connected communities for economic justice. And you can register that. You can just Google Seeking Justice at ASU. You can find our webpage and you can register for that Zoom. I know that there's lots of questions that's left. People want to know how to join you in your organization or support the work that your organization does. And I'll just say that they can find you online and figure out there are different ways of getting involved. So thank you so much. Thank you again to the students and other attendees who are with us today.